I say we must act now.
The New York Times, Dateline, Washington, January 20th, 1937. Franklin Delano Roosevelt today took for the second time the oath as President of the United States. He admonished any who may doubt it that the power implicit in the Constitution was sufficient to solve problems utterly beyond individual or local action.
Re-elected by the largest margin in history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt has the White House and an overwhelming majority in Congress. But the Supreme Court is another matter.
At the turn of the year 1937, when he was inaugurated, 8, 10, or 12 New Deal statutes had been held unconstitutional in a row in a very short time. And it looked as though the whole thing was going down the drain and the country would be in the grip of economic misery and the government would be powerless to deal with it. And Roosevelt felt, I think we must understand, that he had to do something quickly.
New York Times columnist and reporter Anthony Lewis provides the reporter's perspective as we report on the New Deal, the court-packing controversy, live from the past. President Roosevelt's first term comes in the midst of the worst depression in the country's history. To a frightened nation, Roosevelt offers hope.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
He also offers action through an alphabet soup of agencies he calls the New Deal. Federal government insurance for banks, federally financed electricity for farms, federal reorganization of agriculture, and through the NRA, the National Recovery Act, federal regulation of industry. But on what New Dealers call Black Monday, 1935, the U.S. Supreme Court rules the NRA and other New Deal programs unconstitutional. Congress has taken more economic power for the federal government, says the court, and given more power to the president than the Constitution allows. FDR reacts quickly. He proposes, and Congress passes, a second New Deal of economic programs. Social Security pensions for the elderly, a minimum wage and the right to join unions for workers, public service jobs for the unemployed. But New Deal critics say the second New Deal programs are as unconstitutional as those of the first New Deal. With the Supreme Court's membership unchanged, FDR's second New Deal could be headed for a second Black Monday. 1936, Franklin Roosevelt is re-elected, winning every state except Maine and Vermont. The Democrats increase their majority in Congress. At his second inaugural, FDR lays out his unfinished agenda.
I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished.
And takes the oath of office from Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, leader of the Black Monday Court.
You, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear, reserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help you God.
FDR says later, not the kind of Constitution your court has raised up as a barrier to progress and democracy. Settling in for his second term, FDR opens up a new campaign, not against the Republicans, but against the Supreme Court.
And I defy anyone to read the opinions concerning the AAA, the Railroad Retirement Act, the National Recovery Act, the Guffey-Cole Act, and the New York Minimum Wage Law, and tell us exactly what, if anything, we can do for the industrial worker in this session of the Congress with any reasonable certainty that what we do will not be nullified as unconstitutional.
The members of the Supreme Court, says Roosevelt, are men of a bygone era. 5 of the 9 were born during or before the Civil War. 4 have been on the court since before the First World War. They are too old to keep up with the court's heavy workload, says FDR, too old to understand the economic emergency the country now faces. FDR cannot replace the Supreme Court justices. The Constitution gives them lifetime tenure. But he asks Congress to give Supreme Court justices pensions so that they can retire if they want. And for each justice over 70 who does not retire, he asks for power to appoint 1 new justice, increasing the size of the court from 9 to as large as 15. He calls it the Judicial Reorganization Bill. The president, who has persuaded Congress to pass the laws that make up the New Deal, now asks it to pass a law that he believes might save the New Deal. He offers reorganization supporters additional anti-depression programs for their home states and appointments to federal office for their constituents, favors he threatens to withdraw from opponents. But congressional critics call FDR's proposal not court reorganization, but court packing. Even some Roosevelt supporters worry that a future president might abuse the power that FDR is asking for.
A packed jury, a packed court, and a stuffed ballot box are all on the same moral plane. This is more power than a good man should want or a bad man should have.
And Republicans, who oppose much of the New Deal, don't want to change the outcome of the court's anti-New Deal decisions.
I am opposed to packing the court for the purpose of controlling its constitutional decisions, whether by the president or anybody else.
While FDR tries to change Congress's mind, the court seems to be changing its mind.
Dateline, Washington, March 29, 1937. By a 5-4 decision, the numerical division by which it struck down the New York minimum wage law, the Supreme Court today held constitutional a similar statute for the state of Washington. Justice Owen J. Roberts switched from the conservative to the liberal side and turned what had been a minority view into the controlling opinion of the court.
Within months, a 5-4 majority of the court decides that the Wagner Act, a New Deal law giving workers the right to join labor unions, is constitutional. Justice Willis Vandevanter announces that he will retire. Just days later, the court rules that the Social Security Act is constitutional. FDR seems to have won his war with the Supreme Court, but he continues his battle for the Judicial Reorganization Bill. How are my chances with Congress? He asks Vice President John Nance Garner. You want it with the bark on or off, Cap'n, replies the crusty Texan. The rough way, says Roosevelt. All right then, says Garner, you're beat. You haven't got the votes.
Dateline, Washington, July 22nd, 1937. Court bill is killed, 70-20. A Senate galleries cheer. A full surrender. Opponents in full sway.
The defeat of Roosevelt's Judicial Reorganization Bill preserves the 9-member court, and someone quips that the court's switch in time has saved 9. FDR's New Deal is intact, but his court reorganization plan is in tatters. New York Times reporter and columnist Anthony Lewis has covered the Supreme Court and legal affairs.
What made it controversial when President Roosevelt proposed the court packing plan in January 1937 was that it was so obvious what he was trying to do. He didn't say 9 judges aren't enough, we should have more, or something like that. He said we need new blood. And what he meant was he wanted to change the results, and everybody knew that he meant that, and he chose a rather sort of slippery way of doing it. He said they're too old, they can't handle the work, and so we have to have, for everyone who is of retirement age and doesn't retire, hint, hint, we'll appoint another judge up to 15. So instead of, at that point, there were so many of retirement age that instead of having 9, you were going to have 15, hence packing 6 more judges.
What was wrong with FDR's idea to increase the size of the Supreme Court?
Because the court is, to an extent, supposed to be insulated from immediate political pressures. And the compromise is that presidents appoint and the Senate confirms. That gives you a political input today, in the sense of today's politics in a democratic country are involved in the appointment. But then the person sits for a long time. And so today's politics fade, and you hope you have a longer run sense of the law and the Constitution in that member of the court. I don't think we would want to have a system in which a president can suddenly change the whole outlook of the Supreme Court. It wouldn't give you confidence in the nature of that institution. It would just be another political institution. The constitutional system has survived for more than 200 years, and the only reason it has is because we've had the stabilizing influence of the Supreme Court.
Was the switch in time, the court's approval of the second New Deal programs, the key factor that defeated Roosevelt's bill and saved the 9-member Supreme Court?
The change in those two sets of cases is simply astonishing, because we think of a court as as an institution, the Supreme Court, that changes very slowly and only carefully and over time. But in this case, within a period of a year, it absolutely turned topsy-turvy on many of these issues, the commerce power, the power of the federal government to deal with economic questions. It simply reversed itself without ever actually saying so. It just said, well, you know, that was another case, now we're dealing with this case. I think it did so because they saw danger to the institution, and one member of the court changed his views, and then the whole court tempered its view and saw that it had to temper itself to the wind of reality.
What about Justice Roberts, the justice who switched his vote to uphold the New Deal? What made him change his mind?
No one knows for certain what was in Owen Roberts' mind. I think Owen Roberts, on his own, decided that the court as an institution was in danger. And one thing that happens to most members of that court, whatever their views and however fiercely they may be in a debate, as the court was divided over these issues, they believe in the institution and they're going to do what they can to protect it. All the members of the court, however they voted, were very protective of the institution. And I think that did motivate Justice Roberts to moderate his views and say, yes, there has to be some room for economic experimentation.
Did Roosevelt's court-packing defeat have a political impact on Roosevelt during his remaining 8 years as president?
The defeat of Roosevelt in the court-packing plan was a disastrous one for him politically. It was very difficult for him after that ever again to summon up the kind of presumption of validity in Congress that he had had. Perhaps because it showed he could be beaten, perhaps because people no longer feared his political judgment as much since it had been bad. There's no doubt that it hurt him terribly politically, terribly. He lost a lot of seats in 1938 in Congress, the next election. The public never lost faith in Roosevelt, certainly not altogether. I mean, after all, he was elected 4 times.
Did Roosevelt lose the court-packing battle but win the war to change the makeup of the Supreme Court?
In the long run, Roosevelt won the victory of what kind of Supreme Court we're going to have. At least as far as economic matters are concerned, we have had ever since a court that doesn't think, on the whole, that that's its business. And those who came to the court, the Roosevelt appointees, it wasn't just that they were young, but they had lived through what we now see as the disastrous mistakes of the old court, and they were determined not to repeat those mistakes of seeking to find language in the Constitution that really wasn't there, that said you couldn't do this or that economic thing.
Late 1937 brings a downturn in the economy. Not a full-blown depression this time, but a recession, a milder malady. Once again, FDR proposes and Congress passes New Deal-type economic legislation, minimum wage, farm price supports, and public housing bills. Over the next 4 years, age and attrition give FDR the pro-New Deal court that Congress denied him. 5 justices with an average age of 75 retire. 5 Roosevelt appointees, average age 50, take their places. The court now belongs to the New Deal generation, They will make their influence felt for the next 30 years. Presidents after Roosevelt will find their proposals thwarted by Supreme Court rulings, and presidents will appoint justices who they believe will make the court more liberal or more conservative.
I think the court packing plan is alive in at least historical memories today and relevant because it was the greatest test of a unique American institution. It seemed that Americans did not want to tamper with this rather holy institution, which it saw as the ultimate safeguard of people's freedom.